Good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar titled The Geopolitics and Economics of COVID-19 Views on China and the World. My name is Joe Thomas Karakat and I'm currently in charge of the IIT Madras China Studies Center. This webinar is part of the Foreign Policy Conversations lecture series that we've planned here at IIT Madras China Studies Center. I'm very happy to share that as of now, we have participants from 13 countries who are attending this webinar, and we are currently oversubscribed for this event. Coming to the topic of discussion today, COVID-19 has foisted major economic challenges on the world, and the geopolitical and economic fallouts of this pandemic will shape the world as we knew it. China's handling of the pandemic has drawn varying responses. And we at IIT Madras, the China Studies Center, felt that a panel to discuss some of these issues was timely. Some of the key talking points that our panel of experts would discuss would cover whether we are entering into some new geopolitical competition. Is the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China set to intensify? Or, as some other scholars argue, are we already at the cusp of a changing world order? Basically, the argument being that interdependent economic relations in East Asia, Southeast Asia, do not give some of those actors the luxury of antagonizing China. Apart from the theme centered on geopolitics, we'll also have a discussion on whether we are looking at some kind of a retreat from globalization. According to the World Trade Organization, we are expecting global merchandise trade to shrink by 13 to roughly 30% in the short term. This is basically a pessimistic view that we might have to be prepared for a new economic normal. That is, we are moving into difficult times. Versus a set of scholars who argue that we need to take an optimistic view that says that it is not the end of capitalism and globalization as we know it. Our panelists would also share informed views on China, taking a historical long view, a view on India-China relations, whether realistically India can replace China in global production chains. How does the pandemic shape this important bilateral relationship? To discuss all of these issues, IIT Madras China Studies Center has partnered with some of the best minds in the domain. Let me introduce our speakers for today formally. Professor Rana, St. Cross Fellow at Oxford University, is currently Director of the University China Center, University of Oxford. His most recent book, China's War with Japan, 1937 to 45, Struggle for Survival, was named as a 2013 Book of the Year in the Financial Times and The Economist, and also won the 2014 Duke of Westminster's Medal for Military Literature. Thank you very much, Professor Mitter, for joining us. We have with us Professor C. Raja Mohan, currently Director at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Professor Raja Mohan was founding Director of Carnegie India and the Henry Kissinger Chair in International Affairs at the Library of Congress. Professor Raja Mohan has previously served on India's National Security Advisory Board. Good to see you, Professor Raja Mohan. Please unmute.
Thank you, John.
Right. We have with us Mr. Casey Kwok, who is the Asia Global Fellows Program Director at the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. Mr. Kwok was formerly the government economist of the Hong Kong SAR government and the regional chief economist of Standard Chartered Bank for East Asia. We are very happy to have you with us, Mr. Kwok.
My pleasure to be here.
Next, we have Professor Wu, who teaches at the School of Public Policy and Management, Tsinghua University in Beijing. Professor Wu was Associate Dean at the School of Public Policy and Management in 2007 and 2015. He works on state-owned enterprises and China's economic development. Good to see you, Professor Wu.
Yeah. Good to see you. I'm happy to be here.
Next, we have Dr. Anuradha Balaram. She has served as a member of the Indian Economic Service for 3 decades in various advisory capacities. Dr. Balaram was previously Chief Economic Advisor and Member Secretary to the Kerala State Planning Board and is currently member of the Board of Governors of the Indian Institute of Management in Indore. Thank you, ma'am, for taking time out for our webinar.
Good evening. Nice to be here.
Our final speaker for today would be Professor Alka Acharya. She teaches at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Acharya is former director of the Institute of Chinese Studies. She was nominated by the Indian government as a member of the India-China Eminent Persons Group and has served as member of the National Security Advisory Board. Thank you, ma'am, for taking time out for our webinar today.
Pleasure to be here, Joe. Nice to be with such a distinguished panel, and I'm really looking forward to listening to you.
I'd now request Professor Mitter to initiate discussion based on the themes we've broadly discussed. In the interest of preserving bandwidth for all our viewers, I request Professor Mitter also to introduce the subsequent speakers so that we have a conversation going. And by the time Professor Acharya concludes, I could then take over for the question and answer session.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Could I just check, can I be heard?
Loud and clear.
Fantastic. Okay, well, first of all, I think many thanks to Joe and the whole team at IIT Madras. It's quite an achievement to bring together a virtual seminar of this sort, particularly with participants from 13 countries, both listening and speaking. And I'd like to greet my distinguished fellow speakers. We won't have huge amounts of time for interaction, so I just want to say it's a great honor to be on the call with all of you. I think you have been warned, but just to say our host here is a very, very rigorous man and has made it clear that we have 10 minutes maximum each to speak. So at 9 minutes, a little flashcard will come up with saying IIT Madras, China Institute. That is a signal that you have 1 minute left for your comments. And I'm going to try and prove a good example by speaking for as concise a time as possible. So reminder that 10 minutes is the maximum and not the minimum. And as Joe suggests, I'll come in between you and just pass on to the next person. But to preserve people's time, I won't say too much more. We will have question and answers and more chance for discussion in the 10-15 minutes at the end. Okay, so what I'd like to do really to set the discussion off is to make one point, but to make the point in 4 parts, each of which I'll take a couple of minutes to speak on. And that is to get to the heart of a question which those who are in China, which I think would include Wu Jiaoshou, who I can see over there, but also those of us on the call who are constantly trying to understand China. I think what I want to stress is the multidimensionality of China's current model, both domestically and to the world, and to use that idea of multidimensionality to try and put forward an idea which I'd love to hear people agree with, disagree with, debate, you know, whatever it might be. But that's the way that I like to look at it. Because it seems to be sometimes the questions we're asking about China in the world, both pre and post-COVID pandemic, are a little bit monolithic. You know, is China going to collapse? Is China going to take over the world? Is China going to produce an entirely new model for the world community? And I don't think any of these things simplistically on their own are enough. Instead, what I'd like to suggest is that there are 4 factors that I think shape what I see in China today and the way I see it moving forward. And the point I want to make is it's the interaction between these factors that make more than the sum of the parts. In other words, each one of them is interesting, and I'll say, you know, a minute or so on each one of these factors. But it's the interaction, the multidimensionality, the ability of these factors to be more than the sum of their parts that I think really makes the Chinese proposition, if you want to put it that way, very different from anything we see in much of the rest of the world, including in India, of course. So what are these four factors that I want to bring together? The first one is China's authoritarian one-party system of government. The second is China's move towards a very consumer-driven economic model. The third is China's move towards globalization. And the fourth is China's relatively recent but very noticeable status as a technological innovator. And I want to put these four things together in a model to suggest that it's the combination of those things that matters. First of all, in terms of authoritarian government, I think one of the biggest changes since the financial crisis of 2008 is the growing sense within China itself that its system of operation, one party, highly illiberal, and with a very limited space for civil society and public discourse, is not some kind of pale imitation of a liberal alternative, but rather a valid model in its own right. And there are Western scholars, as well as Chinese, who have tried to articulate this model, the most notable perhaps being Professor Daniel Bell of Tsinghua and Shandong universities, who talks about the Chinese model as a meritocracy. Now, whether or not that's accurate is a subject of debate, but the fact is that it's out there as a form of discussion in terms of looking at why China's model of governance may be different. And it's within that model that we have to understand things such as, I think, the growing or rather shrinking space for wider public discussion in the media, in the academic world, online, and so forth. I think anyone in China and also elsewhere would say that the space for free discussion, which was always limited, has become much less in the last 5 to 6 years rather than more. So that's aspect number one. And generally, authoritarian systems don't translate very well outside their own cultural and economic environments. Although the fact that we're living in a very populist, nationalistic time around the world may move us in a different sort of direction on that. But point number two about consumerism is that China has, for the moment, cracked the problem that defeated the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was defeated in part by the Cold War, by Ronald Reagan, by Western liberal ideas, all of this, sure, nuclear weapons. But in the end, it was the inability of the Soviet Union to provide a high standard of living to its population that really, in the end, doomed it as a social project. And that's one mistake the Chinese Communist Party has very much taken on board. Anyone who knows China will know that standards of living in cities such as Shanghai are certainly equivalent to those in many parts of Southern Europe. And broadly speaking, while China remains a very unequal country, it's also a much richer one in which standards of living on issues like consumer goods, holidays, and so forth have certainly improved. Then globalization. Obviously, China within the last 5 to 6 years, particularly under Xi Jinping, has taken a path which involves particularly the promotion of the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative as a new model of understanding China, not just as a domestic actor, but as a developmentalist actor which brings together illiberal politics and economic development as a proposition in countries around the world, notably in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The model is more successful in some places than others, and it's certainly not top-down coordinated from Beijing, but it's real, and it certainly has a certain amount of effect. And the fourth point about technology, I think, is a crucial one. Until 5 to 10 years ago, the assumption was that China could not innovate at a first-tier level in terms of its technology. Silicon Valley was everything. Now I think that there is a lot more doubt about that. I still think that in terms of very new first-tier development of new technologies, China has not yet reached that particular stage. But in terms of a whole variety of areas, artificial intelligence most notably, and certainly in terms of the application of technology to consumption, excuse me, such as e-shopping and so forth, that's clearly become a major way in which the Chinese polity and society has been changed beyond recognition, and provides a model which, at least in part, has attractions to other societies which would not necessarily want to take on board China's China's political model. So bearing that in mind, let me finish with a thought about the difference that COVID makes. In the short term, I think COVID makes a big difference. There's been quite a lot of opinion poll survey. In fact, the British Foreign Policy Group think tank has just put out online, you can find it, ratings on various countries around the world, and China's international reputation has really dipped very low in the last few weeks. China's reputation at home amongst its own citizens is doing quite well, with a general feeling that the epidemic has been handled well in the last few weeks, having been handled disastrously in the first few weeks, has clearly internationally suffered a great deal. So I think a key question, and I don't have an answer to that question, but I kind of will leave the webinar with that to think about, is can China meaningfully overcome that current COVID crisis in terms of its international reputation? Is it able to use its own resources, such as obviously very high level of scientific development, which could help contribute to a vaccine, or other issues such as international climate change, where it seems to have a role, to actually pull itself out of this reputational black hole and move forward? Or, as the current indications seem to be, is it going to go for the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy? In other words, a stance of China with its back against the world, telling the world that if they have criticisms, that it's the world that's wrong, but not China. Both of those paths are possible at the moment. It's going to be very exciting finding out what the answer to that question is. But for now, we are still at the cusp of a very important moment, and we'll have to see what happens. So I'll leave that thought there, because I see my 9-minute indicator has come up, and I will move straight to speaking. Oh, sorry, actually, I've lost my list. Where has it gone? Here's it gone. Here's my list. Oh, now where is it? Oh, here it is. Yes. And I'm going to turn straight to Professor Raja Mohan, the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. Singapore, obviously, right in the heart of many of these discussions, a very crucial spot, and also one that, of course, is suffering somewhat from COVID at the moment. So, Professor Raja Mohan, could I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Professor Mita, and thank you, Joe, for having me here in this meeting. So I think Joe has put a lot of issues on the table, and some of them were picked up by Dr. Mita. What I will do is just take up 3 broad themes that on the table today. One is on the role of the state, how that is changing in the post-COVID environment. Second, on the prospects for US-China conflict. And third, on the emerging competitive multilateralism, shall we say, that the new tensions in the level of the global institutions. So I'll just stick to this 3 points in the 10 minutes that I have. So on the role of the state, that it was just a few years ago that the world seemed to be celebrating the demise of the state, idea that the economic globalization, the dramatic expansion of international economic cooperation, the digital transformation, and the rise of supranational institutions together were really relegating state to a marginal position in a world that was widely seen as borderless, and it was easy for people to work without the encumbrance of a dominant state in each of the nations, shall we say. But I think one of the things that the COVID crisis has shown is the state is back. The state is back in a big way, whether it is in the form of big government that is spending huge amounts of money to protect the economy at this point of time, whether there's an acting decisively to close borders, even in an integrated region like the European Union, the pressure to close borders and for the state to limit movement across its borders. We've seen that as well. And the use of state coming in to use surveillance in a mass scale to deal with the pandemic are some of the new features that we've seen come to the fore. So that raises an interesting question that is there a convergence actually for all the talk about China being a different state model and it's the free world versus the closed societies argument that has sharpened in recent days. But both are, there is surveillance capital in the US and there is surveillance state in China. So surveillance, the use of digital technology by different actors, by different means in which it is being mediated. But we've seen powerful centralizing forces in both the systems. So does that mean there is a convergence actually between the two models? While that idea is interesting, but I would say the nature of politics continues to remain different in both the parts. We see in the US today open contestation on all the issues that the COVID has raised. We see in India, the federal issue, a whole range of themes working themselves out. But in China, the seeming absolute dominance of a single state that seems to be in control, that is not what we see, probably is not what we fully understand. We've seen for a brief period in February, when in Wuhan, when issues of the came to the fore, there was a moment where public seemed to come up very, very strongly to intervene in the debate and raise questions, but that was quickly shut down. So the nature of politics will remain the same, but while many common centralizing features are visible in both the forms of society. But equally interesting, I think, is the changes within each state, certainly in the West and in the democracies. The question of what is the relationship between state and capital? How does it regulate? How does the state regulate the relationship between capital and labor? Those issues have come to the fore, and this is going to compel, I think, a fundamental rethinking on how much should the state do, for example, on healthcare in societies like the US, where there is no state support. So are we going to see some significant changes in the way the democracies are organized? Certainly, that's going to be an issue. And within them, are we seeing interesting shift in coalitions? People are talking about Tory socialists in Britain and the Republicans championing working class. So I think the crisis is going to compel some rejigging of the coalitions within the Western world. And what happens in that rejigging would have a significant impact on the rest of the world. But I think one thing is quite clear: as the backlash against globalization grows, the role of the state in taking a fresh look at the relationship between capital and labor and the rest of the society, I think it's going to be quite paramount, and we're going to see that play out in a significant way. The second element I wanted to touch upon is the Sino-US rivalry that we've seen for 40 years in living in Singapore, where the integration of China and the US was heralded as a hugely stabilizing force in Asia. Firstly, the absence of confrontation between the two provided a long peace in the region, and the economic integration between the US and China produced enormous opportunities for the entire region to grow. But now the talk about decoupling this US-China relationship is a huge concern in much of Asia, and no one is sure here how this is going to play out. But looking at the US-China confrontation, I think we stand at a paradox. On the one hand, quite clearly the pressure is mounting on both President Trump as well as President Xi to be seen as standing tough, uncompromising positions to the other. But yet both need each other. For example, while Trump might make China the question in the election, he also needs the Chinese to buy stuff to alleviate some of his immediate problems with some of his core constituencies in the agricultural states. Similarly for China, for all the wolf warrior diplomacy, I don't think President Xi can completely abandon the room for some compromise. So I think navigating that, standing tall at home, but at the same time leaving some flexibility abroad is going to be quite interesting. So the tactical level, we are at quite a mixed. We have a mixed situation, and while in the longer term it looks US and China are headed for a collision, but there again, a decoupling question becomes important. How easy it is to do it? How much can you do it? On these issues, there are deep differences within the US of how to deal with China. The crisis has not eliminated those differences between the Republicans and Democrats and between different groups. And I presume similar differences exist within China on how to deal with the US. So the divisions within these establishments, I think, makes it even more of a contingent moment, that how the US-China relationship plays itself out is going to be very contingent on a number of factors and a number of decisions, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them stupid. But that's what makes it, I think, this moment such a dangerous and a very interesting one for those of us who live by trying to analyze this stuff. The third issue I wanted to touch upon is on the competitive multilateralism. I think there has been this misnomer, somehow we were in this golden age of multilateralism. I don't think the golden age of multilateralism lasted more than a decade in the 1990s, when for a brief moment there was absence of great power rivalry and the strength of the Washington consensus seemed to prevail. I think that period was lost quite early on. I mean, by 2000s, the renewed tensions among major powers was already beginning to emerge, and those have certainly sharpened. The UN and the UNSC, which was supposed to play a larger role, once again got deadlocked by the differences among the major powers. And the trade institutions, which seemed, the growth of global trade and the triumph of trade institutions, even that has begun to come under a shadow, thanks to the backlash against globalization in the West, in the US in particular. So whether it's WTO or WHO, the pressures to restructure and the pressures from US and China to reorganize, to rearrange these institutions has already begun. While we fight in the old institutions, both sides are already setting up new institutions. For example, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Belt and Road Initiative is the single largest economic initiative outside the classical institutions that came up in the post-war period. The US too is experimenting with Quad, it's experimenting with free and open Indo-Pacific. The Japanese have their Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. So we're already in a phase of competitive multilateralism. And within this, I think the current situation is going to make it a lot worse. So where does that bring us? I mean, I would say in what would it mean for India? I would just say three things quickly. I think the state is back, but the question for India is what kind of state? In India, the big state never went out. The state remains still fairly dominant in India. But I think the COVID moment presents Delhi an opportunity to redesign what the state must do in the economic sphere, whether there's been absolutely no investments in the social sector. Can they do more in the health sector? So I think there is a moment here. Prime Minister Modi is talking about self-reliance. I don't know if he's going back to lessons for Madras, or is it a reconstituting Indian state, somewhat different from the 70s, but also different from the last few years. So that's one question. Second, I think the US-China rivalry gives opportunities, I think, for India to leverage its standing in the world today. It sits in BRICS, it sits in the Quad. So for India, I think there might be a sweet moment where it can leverage this to its national advantage. And finally, on the multilateralism, if you have the stomach to navigate this dynamic, because if it is a bipolar situation, as we go back to the Cold War, many of us had many advantages, and I think some of those might return, because a US-China condominium or US-China or a chimerica left many of us with limited options. So confrontation, a limited one like a Goldilocks one, a renewed confrontation could actually give us a lot more possibilities in the multilateral agencies. So I'll stop here, and I'll take your permission to get off the video, but I'm there on the audio. So thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Professor Raja Mohan. I apologize because of connection problems. I didn't actually hear any of your talk, but I'm sure it was excellent. I'm now going to move on to Professor Casey Kwok, Director of the Asia Global Fellows Program at HKU and former government economist to the Hong Kong SAR government. Professor Kwok, please, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Mita. I hope my voice is coming through okay.
Right now it's coming through fine.
Good, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here having a dialogue with all the friends around the world. Well, in the introduction, I think Professor Mita has raised a lot of interesting issues. I have not really actually prepared for it. So I'll try. I may be jumping around issues from here and there, all over the place. Bear with me. First of all, I just want to have a very quick recap of the economic situation. We all know that this is a very serious economic challenge for everybody around the world. It is comparable in scale to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Figures released yesterday from the US, for example, shows that over the last 7 weeks or so, the initial jobless claims was about a total of about 34 million. Estimates put the unemployment rate in the US now probably at around 20%. Bear in mind that during the Great Depression, unemployment rate in the US was around 25%. The Bank of England has forecasted that the UK economy will probably suffer its deepest recession in the past 300 years. So we are really facing a very serious economic situation. I don't want to go through all these, descriptions of what we are doing that are probably very familiar to most of us here. But I would really like to highlight, well, first of all, governments around the world have been a lot more effective and quick on their feet to take measures to deal with the situation. Overall, the central banks, the major central banks around the world has done whatever they need to stabilize the situation. And luckily, we had this crisis about more than 10 years ago, which resulted in a lot of reforms in the financial system. So banking systems around the world are very secure, well capitalized. So despite all the financial market volatilities, we don't really have a full-blown financial crisis. I think that is the good news. The other big piece of good news is that governments are very proactive in introducing various measures to deal with the economic downturn, to cushion the economic recession, to protect the livelihood of the employees, and to protect the support businesses and so on. I think that is the good news. How are we going to do going forward? I think, of course, will depend very much on the development of the disease, the availability of vaccines, and so on. There are still a lot of uncertainties before us. Well, IMF or other organizations put forward economic forecasts, but very quickly they have to revise those forecasts down. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for people to come up with forecasts with a lot of confidence. So we just have to deal with the situation. But given that the development of vaccines will take a prolonged period of time, probably for another year, maybe 1.5 years, I think the likelihood of having travel restrictions, quarantine requirements, social distancing measures, and all that will have to continue. They may come and go in cycles, relaxing and tightening and so on, but we have to go through different cycles of this development for the next year, maybe longer. So it is unlikely that we will go back to normal life or normal business anytime soon. So I think the economic challenge will continue to be there. Apart from the macro ups and downs, I think there are also important economic lessons to be learned, particularly in terms of some of the structural changes that we have seen. The most obvious ones are the adoption of digital channels of communication, a lot more e-commerce, the delivery systems, work from home arrangements, the kind of meetings we are going through now instead of meeting face to face. And there are also new e-commerce models, such as the more commonly adopted tele-doctors and so forth. So I think, well, actually, if you look at the results announced by some of the biggest US technology companies, they are still doing very well in the first quarter of this year. The bigger technology companies will probably continue to do even better going forward, but a lot of SMEs are suffering. A lot of traditional business are suffering. Anything related to air travel, hotels, entertainment, theme parks, and so on, are going to continue to suffer for a prolonged period of time. And we also need to bear in mind that, well, you look at some of the biggest Chinese technology companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and so forth, they actually grew significantly after the 2003 SARS epidemic. So I think what we're going through now are going to produce a lot more changes in digital business. Of course, as some of our earlier speakers have referred to, and I will talk a little bit about that, is the risks related to extended supply chains and deglobalization. Well, first of all, on deglobalization, I think that there will definitely be some deglobalization because, well, first of all, because of natural business reasons, people now realize that just-in-time inventory management, having very extended supply chains actually incurs a lot of risks that you have to think about much more seriously now. So I think there will be some cutting back in terms of global supply chains and globalization practices and so forth. But on the whole, I don't think this is going to happen very quickly. if you think about it from a business angle, most companies, apart from some of the high-tech companies I mentioned earlier on, most companies are not in a very aggressive investment mode at the current juncture. When business conditions are like this, you want to preserve cash, you don't want to invest aggressively. But to change supply chains, you need to invest. And furthermore, supply chains and globalization have their own logic. They are based on technological developments over time. They are based on efficiency improvements that could be achieved. So from a long-term perspective, I think these globalization trends will continue, but there will be some waves or cycles. It is like a 3-step forwards and 1-step back situation. So there may be some stepping back from this development, but I don't think this is going to change, for the longer term future. On the authoritarian one-party state and so on and so forth, I think we could have, if we have time, we could discuss that even more. But one point I think is also very important. At a time of significant economic and social strain, powerful governments, very effective governments, strongman rule, or even authoritative governments, I think have some appeal. The worry is if this continues to develop and grow, the long-term implications are going to be significant. And the growth of populism is another very significant dimension. So I think from the political angle, and all these, I'm not talking about only the political side of it, I'm also talking about the economic impact of all these political developments. Let's not forget that Adolf Hitler was elected, at the most difficult time of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So if you look around the world, we have seen political developments here and there that are not particularly encouraging. Finally, I just want to highlight another point that perhaps have not been discussed very widely. As we look forward, we know that we're going to continue to encounter economic difficulties. The world is not going to come back to the growth rates that we have seen in the past years. Domestic demand will take some time to pick up. Trade is not going to help you to recover. So I think it's probably time for governments to start thinking about how do you restart your economy through investment. Of course, many governments know that, well, it's time of tight budgets and so on and so forth. But global interest rates are going to remain at a very low level for a very long time. Some of the bigger countries are going to run fiscal deficits of 10% of GDP, 15% of GDP, and I think the world simply have to swallow it. By investment, I'm thinking not only of the traditional investments like physical infrastructure like bridges and roads and railways. I think there are definitely going to be room for investment in the digital infrastructure, which doesn't necessarily take a lot of money, but it will help to promote a lot more potential for economic development going forward, particularly that we need to look forward, for new business ideas. I'm thinking more like investments in green infrastructure, and sometimes it's more the policy framework for green development rather than a lot of physical investment. But this is, the kind of investments that governments need to introduce if you want to revive economies, generate new areas of growth, and stimulate the economy to, rely on new forces, more innovative development rather than the old forces. And of course, I also would include investments in the software infrastructure like healthcare systems, education systems, support for the underprivileged, and so on, because all these problems actually have been highlighted very clearly in the current economic downturn and economic difficulties. The political support is there. The governments, I think it's a very good opportunity for the governments to take advantage of the crisis to look ahead and think creatively. In the interest of time, I think I better stop here, but I'm very happy to to continue to discuss the issues with later. Thank you.
Professor Wu, you could just keep on speaking. We can hear you. You could make your presentation. We can.
Okay, let's move. Let me move on. My topic was assigned by Joe. It's on the economic resilience in the course of pandemic. So I can be heard.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, let me move on. When we talk about the issue of the impact of pandemic on Chinese economy, it concerns three different issues. Number one, the economic transformation and upgrading, which has been in place for quite a couple of years. And number two, the US-China trade war. And number three, the pandemic. And about the economic transformation and the upgrading, it means the change from labor-intensive and resource consumption to technology-intensive and innovation-driven, moving up to the global supply chains. The controversial Made in China 2025 represents such an intention. Because of the transformation and upgrading, the economy has been slowed down in recent years. So the transition is quite ambitious, challenging, and painful. The China-US trade war makes it even more difficult, but the trade war will not change the trend. Then it comes pandemic. Pandemic is adding more difficulties to the effort. The immediate impact of the pandemic on the economy is devastating. The growth rate of GDP dropped by 6.8% in the first quarter of this year, the biggest decline since 1992. As the pandemic is under control, the recovery of the economy, a couple of measures to recover the economy. Even though the pandemic impacts Chinese economy enormously in the short run, but in the long run, the transformation and upgrading will continue because the Chinese economy is quite resilient in terms of many aspects. Domestically, China has a huge market with 1.4 billion population and with 10,000 per capita. So it's a huge market. And domestic consumption contributes 57.8% to last year's GDP growth. So it's a rapid increase. And China's economy has solid fundamentals in terms of many aspects. The Chinese economy has sound infrastructure, not only in traditional meaning of infrastructure. It means roads, ports, airports, railways, but also communications infrastructure. China claims more than half of 4G base stations of the world combined, with 3.8 million 4G base station. It's 10 times of the US. So it's a big advantage because with the support of the communications infrastructure, the internet-related companies in China have developed rapidly. So we have seen Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com, and others. China has also a complete supply chains. China claims the most complete supply chains in the world, so it's a huge advantage. China also has high quality of labor force. So it's another big advantage. In addition, based on expertise in know-how in, so it's also a huge advantage. And recently, Chinese government announced a new scheme focusing on so-called new infrastructure, which covers 7 new areas, including 5G, extra high voltage, intercity rail, speed rails, high-speed rails, electric vehicle charging station, big data center, artificial intelligence, industrial internet. The investment amount is expected to be 15 trillion RMB, more than 2 trillion US dollars. This is a huge amount of investment. This will put fresh stimulus to the economy. So we can see Chinese economy is quite resilient based on these advantages. And globally, people are talking about deglobalization and the decoupling in recent years. The two things are number one, people very often compare the current situation with Cold War. Some argues that there will be a new Cold War or deglobalization or decoupling between the US and China. But I think the current situation is quite different or fundamentally different with the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union created a different system outside the existing capitalist system. So there are two blocks during the Cold War. The two blocks are not only politically competing, but also economically belonging and conflicting. But by the contrast, and since then, China has become part of the global system in the global division of labor, a player to safeguard. So when companies across the world are part of the same global supply chains, it is hard to imagine that decoupling would happen. And both the Chinese companies and the companies in countries have shared interests from globalization. It will continue to benefit from it, and we'll continue to note that China has no intention to establish a new system to replace the existing one. So based on this fundamental fact, I don't think both deglobalization and decoupling will happen. So both domestically and globally, we have shown evidence to believe that Chinese economy continue to grow. The Chinese economic upgrade with value chains will not stop. China's role in the global division of labor will strengthen. So the impact of a pandemic is a short issue, and it can be overcome in the near future, but it can't change the long trend of development of Chinese economy. So I think that's the there will be some change among the country of each countries in the supply chains, but the entire picture will not change. The will continue, and there'll be my argument. I'm ready to hear reaction in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wu. I completely understand the audio lag, and I hope the audience also accommodates the fact that there is a lag in the audio. But Professor Wu made a very important point, particularly regarding a short-term slowdown, but the fact that in the long term, we are going to see growth becoming normalized. The fact that China has a complete supply chain. And with those words, I think I have the fortune of having Professor Mitter back. And so, Professor Mitter, yes, you could please take on. Yeah.
Sorry, Joe, my connection had just come back, so I have no idea where we are.
Dr. Balaram would be next.
I haven't heard anything. Okay, Professor Balaram in that case. Sorry, I haven't heard anything for the last 20 minutes, so we'll go on. Okay, hello, Professor Balaram. Nice to have you here. Do go on ahead.
Good evening. If I'm not clear, Joe, do let me know.
Loud and clear.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here and be part of this session where more than 13 countries are, listening in. And there are two aspects which I'm going to discuss. The first is, will India bounce back from this huge disruption and become a fast-growing economy again? Now, even before COVID-19 made its entry, India was reeling under a slowdown for 6 consecutive quarters. Unemployment was at an all-time high, and real fiscal deficit was hovering around 5%, leaving very little fiscal room for pump priming the economy. And now, with such uncertainty looming ahead, what do we have? What do we look for? You see, even if the virus is contained by September, India is likely to grow at around 2.5% only. Of course, this is a lot better than probably the growth that is going to happen in many of our partner countries. The other silver linings that India has, on which we can build, are the softening of oil prices. Now, because of that, what happens? Our import bill starts looking a little brighter. Every dollar fall per barrel means a saving of rupees 110 billion on an annualized basis. Secondly, India is not as export dependent as many countries in the world. And as a result, the contagion effect of global economic disruption is limited. Thirdly, our service sector is our dominant sector. It caters to about 52% of our gross value added, 38% of our exports, and 25% of our people are employed in the service sector. Now, the service sector, by its very nature, is more agile than the manufacturing sector. So once again here, we have a little room for a quicker recovery. Another good thing is that various non-economic issues that was creating polarization in governance in India has now been shelved, and cooperative federalism is beginning to become visible again. Now, to kickstart growth, what is required? Obviously, we've got to have a combination of fiscal and monetary measures, and we have to realize that each one of these has a potential cost. We need consumption to increase, and Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee has suggested that cash support should be given to the bottom 60% of our population. In addition, of course, agribusiness should be stimulated, micro, small, and medium industries should be given a boost. And for all this, we've got to find the funds. Estimates say that, conservative estimates say that we need at least rupees 10 trillion for some immediate relief. The recent announcement of 1.7 trillion cannot even nick the top of the iceberg. So what can the government do? Our indebtedness, government indebtedness is quite high, 72% of the GDP. But this is the time when the Fiscal Responsibility and Management Act allows for more borrowing. We have no other go. However, ideally, whatever we borrow should be channelized towards avenues which are likely to bring returns so that we can repay the debt. One option for us is to use our foreign exchange reserves, which is reasonably healthy. A portion of this can be used. After all, if we don't use it during a crisis, and this is a crisis, then when are we going to use it? Printing money has a lot of problems. Savings will be hard hit. Our currency will be devalued. That will have a whole lot of ripple effects, which may not be favorable at all in the medium term. But there's a lot of gold in most Indian households. Now, women can be encouraged to consider using this gold to leverage capital to set up and manage relatively risk-free businesses. Women are good crisis managers. We need to involve them more. Now, there's no magic wand. And according to me, a complete transformation is required in our attitude towards wasteful consumption and what direction growth has to take. Now, what's clear to me is that growth for growth's sake, where humanity and environment is sacrificed at the altar of material progress, has to be avoided at all costs. Is it really worth exploiting each and every natural resource and developing high stress and lifestyle diseases just for rapid economic growth, which is going to aggravate inequality, increase hostility, and cause irrevocable environmental damage? Even if India grows at 9% year after year for 15 years, the best that we can achieve is a per capita income which is half of USA. So is this our goal? Or is there something more lofty that we need to look at? The second aspect that I've been asked to discuss is whether it's realistic to expect India to replace China in global production networks. I really don't think that this is the strategy for India. India does not have the sophisticated infrastructure, organizational effectiveness, and the singular efficiency that China has. Instead, what India needs to do is to continue to be a service provider for the world. Services have a low carbon footprint and provide employment locally. We could customize our services through well thought out sustainable solutions for different societies based on their needs. If we are partnering with countries with an aging population, say, we can provide services in holistic health, cultural and spiritual pursuits, niche tourism. If we are partnering with South Asia or Africa, well, they require basic and continuing education, skill upgradation, small business and entrepreneurship development, and we can do that. Our conscious effort could be to identify what services we need to provide to increase the sense of overall well-being for all our partners. And at the same time, we have to be aligned to our goal of decent work and livelihood for our service providers. According to me, government expenditure should catalyze opening of untapped markets, both domestic and export. And where are these? In traditional knowledge, holistic health, sanitation, waste management, energy conservation, green affordable housing, lifelong education, wholesome entertainment. The list is enormous for us to choose from. This will bring employment to the marginalized as well as the grossly underutilized women labor force. And without the need for mass migration to urban areas. We need radical innovation in disaster management, and homegrown local solutions should be prioritized. Global partnerships and FDI can be energized in these areas to bring in required sophistication in design, quality, and delivery. Now, what does India have? We have diverse and original thinking. This can be channelized into, into what the world actually needs. Our outward FDI from India can ensure strategic partnerships and goodwill with host countries. India has not benefited much from regional trade agreements so far. Perhaps it's time for us to build influential partnerships, which bring about the realization of human potential, not mere economic returns. India can probably have a head start in a world geared towards wisdom, well-being, goodwill, and coexistence. Instead of competing for the existing market, new markets could be created, focusing on what humanity really needs and values. Unlearning and relearning is required continuously. Given the right guidance, our young population can adapt to innovative ways rather than rely on non-sustainable growth strategies, which have been adopted by other countries. Now, global statesmanship is at the lowest right now. Global institutions have lost credibility. Perhaps it's time for India to don her non-aligned mantle once again and create a common platform, a common ground of understanding. All ideological differences with our neighbors should be dealt with in such a way that there's no increase in hostility. Otherwise, our scarce budget resources will start shifting towards defense when we need it for development and when we need peace. This we can ill afford. And finally, India is adaptable and has survived through much greater calamities over thousands of years. Every country has something unique to offer to the world. India will flourish by upholding dharma, universal well-being. We need to stop this mad competitive race and furious pace, which will only lead to extinction of humanity. Now, what did Keynes say? Keynes said, the difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas, but in escaping from old ones. It's time for us to see which of the recently acquired, meaning in the last 200, 300 years that we have acquired, which of them are worth keeping and which of them are worth throwing out. Luckily, India has youth power. The old order will be challenged and a new direction will emerge, provided, of course, we let them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Professor. That's great. And I think I'll, still here. And I think our last speaker now is Professor Alka Acharya, of course, a distinguished former director of the Institute for Chinese Studies in New Delhi, and now, of course, at JNU. Alka, please, the floor is yours.
So I'm going to make my presentation far more bullet point-like and try and just, try and not just talk about what I agree with, but talk about what I disagree with, so that one can then see if there's scope for the discussion. Now, I really liked how Rana began by saying that it's important to ask the right questions, because so far, before COVID hit us, we had a set of questions, a set of pet questions, which the international relations world in particular was grappling with, which was the central question of the US-China relationship. But this whole question about China's rise, was China's rise going to wreck the whole system as we knew it? What would it be like, and so on? And all the speakers in their presentations have actually raised the questions, countering the questions that existed earlier. Reminds me of a saying, I forget who said it, but somebody said that if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. So I guess what we have to do really is to get back to asking the right questions. And to my mind, the first question is that we keep talking about a post-COVID situation as if it is just around the corner. I think our first question should begin with that: are we prepared for this COVID situation lasting for at least 2 to 3 years? In which case we are talking of a situation which is pretty much going to be like it is now: fluid, uncertain, chaotic, short-term measures, very, very hard kind of decisions, hardship for a whole lot of people. I mean, these are the kind of issues. What I'm getting at is that as we look at the kind of challenges that the COVID situation presents, for the first time since this system as we know it, the Bretton Woods system, which has been the kind of structure within which nations have engaged with each other, for the first time we have come up against a challenge which does not stop at the water's edge, as it will. The problem now affects each and every individual, each and every person, down to the local levels. And the responses, therefore, have to be of a similar level. I mean, it has to be a human response. It cannot be a statist response. So the question that whether states are going to configure themselves within the domestic sphere in different ways, whether there will be the kind of face-offs that are happening between different states on a different set of issues, I think the current challenge is one where we have to devise solutions from a human perspective. And for that, I think very, very different kinds of institutions, very different kinds of approaches, and very different kinds of leaderships are required. So the first question really is, are we looking at the kind of leadership across the world which is prepared to deal with this current challenge as a human challenge? And to what extent are we prepared to take the kind of decisions that are needed? And unfortunately, at this point of time, both in China and in the US, who was seen as the current dominant countries and the dominant leaderships which were managing the world, as it were, I think Joseph Nye called it the system managers, both of them have come up against a huge credibility challenge. It's not just simply a reputational challenge, I think, as Rana was saying, that it's not just simply, it's also the credibility of this leadership as it exists in China and the US today to provide the kind of a platform where we can bring together people to devise solutions. Because make no mistake, this is a problem which will require cooperation from across the world. So that's the first thing. Second thing I would raise is whether COVID is really the kind of challenge that we are looking at, a geopolitical challenge. I'm not so sure it is a geopolitical challenge, for the simple reason, and Mohan brought this out quite well, that the major challenges that he cited, the challenge to the global institutions or the multilateralism under stress, and so these have been seen for the last decade or more. It's not as if the US and China were not engaging on a conflictual kind of route. It's not as if multilateral institutions were not facing all kinds of stress, whether it was great power rivalry or some other factor. But these were all trends and tendencies which we've been seeing. COVID has simply brought a new kind of challenge, which has shown that a very different response. I mean, we cannot just go by old certitudes. So, so I don't see COVID representing a geopolitical shift or that COVID-19 will become a factor around which a new kind of an order is going to be built up. There is certainly very little to indicate that the pandemic is a kind of a paradigm shift in geopolitics. The pandemic is merely a challenge at the human level, and therefore global human response has to be. And finally, the geoeconomics as well. I think, again, if we are looking at COVID-19 to actually bring about that great schism, the decoupling of the US and China, the great breakdown in the economic global kind of system that we are seeing, again, I would reserve my judgment on that. I do go along with Professor Wu, who said that it is not going to be so easy to decouple the US and China. Sure, we will see some adjustments. We will see an effort at diverting some of the supply chains. Everybody is going to be looking at moving away from this over-dependence on China, but it is not likely to be able to be achieved so soon, particularly because the US and China are engaged and intertwined in a very, very complex manner. So I think, therefore, COVID-19 is not presenting a geopolitical and a geoeconomic challenge, which is something new. In fact, what it is presenting us with political economic challenges, which have been in the making. But what it is presenting us with is a human challenge. And I would go along with Dr. Balaram in saying that a global human response, which brings a cooperative kind of approach from all countries, is the need of the hour. And we need to see how to work towards this. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Alka. Wonderful comments as ever. And I think we hand over to Joe now to run the Q&A session, for which we have about a few minutes, I think.
Right. In the interest of all present till the end, I think I'll just pick up one question, because most of the questions which have come in have already been answered, or maybe two questions. One is a question addressed to Professor Raja Mohan. With an increasing Chinese influence in multilateral organizations, will there be a change in China's approach to public diplomacy?
Want me to answer now?
Yes, Professor Rajamohan.
I think this is Professor Mitra mentioned it right in the beginning. I mean, we've seen China go aggressive on public diplomacy. Whether this is a long-term trend, whether it actually represents a defensive situation at home, we don't know. The diplomacy has gone aggressive, actually demanding others to withdraw any statement, claiming no responsibility, blaming others. Now, we don't know what the reasons for this are. So right now, but this doesn't, I don't think, makes an immediate difference to the kind of influence they have today. It depends on how much counter mobilization. I mean, we're already going to see in 2 weeks at the World Health Assembly what kind of resolution will be brought by the Americans and the Europeans. What is the response among other members? So there will be contestation. So, but the initial response of the Chinese has been very, very aggressive. In fact, in a way, they've lost a lot of goodwill, which is what Professor Mehta was mentioning about loss of reputation, being too aggressive, having come through the crisis. So I think it's been counterproductive in the near term.
The other question we have is, will deglobalization, decoupling decrease inequality within the domestic population with a more equitable distribution of resources in large economies like China, United States, and India? Any one of you may answer that. Will deglobalization, decoupling decrease inequality within the domestic population with a more equitable distribution of resources in large economies like India, China, United States?
May I?
Sure, ma'am.
by itself, it's not going to provide a more equitable distribution or anything. It will depend upon domestic policies. It will depend entirely. Equitable distribution depends upon the way in which a home country thinks. How are we going to, what sort of development strategy are we going to follow? Are we going to centralize everything and or only cater? So that, I don't think just by that it's going to have a, this is just a point which I'll leave to others to take.
Fair enough. And the last question, Professor Mitter, has the pandemic triggered what could be the next Cold War?
I think that the Cold War metaphor, which we hear a lot between Beijing and Washington, is not a very appropriate one, because during the real Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans, both sides were essentially sealed off from each other in all sorts of important ways, and most importantly, economic. The Soviet Union was never an important economic actor in the US or the West, and vice versa. Since there is so much interdependence when it comes to tech, economics, debt, a whole variety of areas between the US and China, I think that whatever happens, and I think that Professor Rajamohan is quite right, that there is a rising aggression in a lot of Chinese language, and there's clearly a rising aggression in the language of the current US administration. We must expect some sorts of much more hostile atmosphere between the two, but it will be historically unprecedented because of the economic links between the two sides. Despite a certain level of decoupling, complete decoupling is not possible, and therefore we'll have to think of a new term to describe it. And if anyone on this call can think of what that new term should be, that would be a very fitting legacy to this very interesting conversation.
Well, can I chip in with a few thoughts?
Sure.
Well, in terms of
Yep.
In terms of China-US relations, the latest talk is this term so-called strategic competition. I don't know what one could, how could interpret this, but right now I think this is the reality, the political reality. And my gut feeling is that things are going to get worse, in the foreseeable future. The second point that I want to add a little comment is on globalization, deglobalization, and the relationship with equality or disparity of income or wealth. I think there are two major issues there, apart from the very good point about domestic policies we have heard just now. Globalization and the impact on equity distribution comes from also a very important dimension, which is technological development. When we come to changes in global supply chains and all that, I think in the future it is quite obvious that even if manufacturing and other operations are going to be redistributed, a lot of them will be automated. That the age of labor-intensive industrial development is gone. To different degrees depending on the industries and so on. And technology development over a very long period of time in history typically would lead to more disparities in income distribution. And unless you don't like technology development, otherwise, I think the impact of technology on income distribution will be with us, from an economic angle. It therefore depends very much on domestic government policies to see how to address the consequences of this impact of technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to end the session with a note of gratitude to all our speakers, Professor Mitter, Professor Rajamohan, Mr. Kwok, Professor Wu, Dr. Balaram, and Professor Acharya. Thank you so much for joining us. I think the audience did appreciate the intellectual feast that we've partaken over the last 1 hour. We look forward to hosting you on other webinars in the future. We would be uploading the entire conversation we had today on YouTube for those of our participants who could not log in due to internet issues. Once again, let me thank all of you for sparing time for us. I have deprived my participants from Singapore, Hong Kong, and China of their dinner for far too long. And thank you very much, Professor Mitter. I've deprived you of lunch for far too long. And on that note, I will bring this session to a close. Also, a big thank you to my team here at IIT Madras, the China Studies Center, the volunteers who've made this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. It was nice to be here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.